what brings us the attention about the Popol Vuh is the mystical tale about Quetzalcoatl, or Hunabku in the Maya language, that had to descend to Mictlan, what is the infraworld or the world of the dead, in order to look for his father. The significance of the mythology and symbolism in this rich tale was inspiration for the representative of the Mexican magic realism, Juan Rulfo. In his novel, Pedro Páramo, Rulfo, in a constant transition between poetry and prose, describes a god's tale from the dead world, where the author decided to refer to the ghost town as Comala, what it means, Comala and Mictlan. There is when we have the connection between the pre-Hispanic Mexican mythology and in Pedro Páramo. Mictlan refers to the place that belongs to the lost souls which haven't yet reincarnated. In the Mexica cosmology, the process of death is not immediately. After the moment of dying, the soul is still next to the body for 4 days. Later on, the body was cremated and still the soul could be around the village and their relative for another 4 days. After that, the soul could descend to the underworld. The connection with Juan Preciado, the main character in Pedro Páramo, is evident since the first lines where Juan Preciado, by command of his mother, who is dying, he must go to Comala to look for his father, the father that he never met. Here's the connection between Juan Comalo and Quetzalcoatl. In the myth of Quetzalcoatl, also Quetzalcoatl must go to Mictlan to look for his father, that he also never met in the Mexica mythology. Rulfo's intentions to connect this ancient mythology in his novel is more evident that the fact in Comala, the same as in the Mictlan, is not possible to avoid the torture of the inner world. It does not exist a Christian salvation where the soul can ask for forgiveness and access to eternity in heaven. The constant pain of Juan Preciado, Susana, and Pedro Páramo, the main characters in the opera, the image of the Mictlan. Another element is the long distance that exists from the point where Juan Preciado began his journey and when finally arrived to Comala. It's a long journey in extremely hot temperatures with no possibility to breathe, like a living hell. And now we can connect the novel Pedro Páramo with the opera Murmullos de Páramo by the author Julio Estrada. Julio Estrada began to investigate Rulfo's literature by the year 1960, when Estrada heard a radio audition spoken by Rulfo, Diles que no me maten. Later on, by 1985, Estrada took once more Rulfo's novel, Pedro Páramo, and started a journey into the land where Rulfo was born. He could feel the presence of the image that Rulfo were constantly evoking in his text. But most of all, Estrada began to perceive a secondary text, between the lines evoking sounds, whispers, and laments, and each time more and more complex musical textures that were implanted in Rulfo's text. By this way, Estrada began to germinate the beginning of his multi-opera. For the composer, to read Rulfo is to activate the perception musicality in the novel. As Estrada describes, texts are splendid examples of his characteristic capacity to evoke sounds and his descriptions, which are subliminal suggestions seeking to find an echo deep within the sensitivity of the auditory memories of his readers. So, here I put a small text from a previous novel of Rulfo, what it was, let's say, the seed of the main inspiration of Estrada to go deeply to seek on the musicality in Rulfo's text. It's from Ljubljana, and the text is very short. It's what is it? What is that noise? It's the silence. And this, the last phrase, is exactly the title what Estrada started to create a book before he started to compose the multi-opera. And the book is with the title El sonido en Rulfo, el ruido ese. It means the sound in Rulfo, that noise, exactly from the text from Rulfo. Another connection with the opera, the novel, and the mythology of Mictlan is observed in the use of the word páramo. The protagonist's father's surname in Rulfo's novel is a windy high plateau, a bleak wasteland. Both páramo is a person and a place, semantically enchanting the intrinsic significance of land and homeland to identity established through the novel. Further in the opera composition, Estrada expresses in a phantasmagorical nature of the characters via the hum, which translates from the Maya language murmur. The hum for soprano, mezzo-soprano, contralto, tenor, and bass becomes the basis for Estrada in compositional methodology, which Estrada describes as the column broken from the opera, as well as Miki Nahual, another piece inside the opera for female voice and double bass, a work full of demoniacal dramatical evocations between life and death of the main character in Rulfo's novel. As Estrada describes it, evocates Juan's voice and lifeless body. In essence, the echo from the myth is a transform in a new poetic for the opera in the 21st century. The mystic and cosmogony was mutated into poetry and prose, and later mutated again into a chant for the dead. So we can see the connections since the myth until the multi-opera. Opera for Murmullos del Páramo. The opera is divided in two parts, Dolorita and San Juan. The opera is filled with sound symbolic of characters and actions. Operatically, nothing like this has ever been attempted before. The text is kept to minimum to fill a new role for the sonic template as a flex spot. The work is pregnant with symbolic work and sound playing and sleight of hand. The scenario and music are specifically the whole of the opera. Estrada's approach is deliberate in this regard. For example, Estrada provides us with trajectories that are new in the opera. The drama is laden with vapors of unseen words, as Susana and Doloritas guide us through an interactive mystery play in two opposite expressive poles of Mexican and Spanish culture. In this sense, the opera is in Mictlan. The creation Estrada conjures requires special marriage between text and sound. Estrada identifies four distinct basic sound imaginaries in Rulfo's novel that he marshaled to his purpose. He reveals specific instances that reflect this through literary, environmental, musical, and imaginary. These four layers are amalgamating text sound and organized as is follows: sonority of speech, sonority of the environment, sonority of the music that what is citated in the novel, and sonority of time. Estrada's understanding of Rulfo's text is one of the most important elements to consider in order to relate the transition from libretto in purely musical work. For Rulfo, the essence is being its sound. Every object and every living thing can find its sound within an overall spectrum of rhythm and sonority that runs from the stone flat to the most vivid. Here in the novel is enough to guide us with our eyes closed through that auditory world that offers us a translucent version of reality. Rulfo's suggestive descriptions strike mnemonic chords in the reader's mind and resonate only in the imagination. This was precisely the domain of sonorities that swelled in my mind the idea of composing an opera on Pedro Páramo. Setting of the opera. The opera is divided in two main acts, Dolorita and Susana San Juan. The first act are the presence of the dead in the night of Comala. The first part is almost passive and in action and contains the presence of dancer representing Juan Preciado, son of Pedro, coming into the infra world following his mother's words. Her voice is mythical, similar to Mother Earth. Some of the action comes from the presence of the murmur ghost. An interlude, Resonant Voices, is made of trombone solo, Pedro, accompanied by voices and instrumental spectrum. The second part is made of action and belongs to reality, sadness, some black humor, joy of love, even if it happens in the infra world. In the first scene, Susana lies at her mother's grave. The second happened inside a mine and let us observe the violation of her freedom by her father, Bartolomé San Juan. The third scene is in the sea, and she enjoys the imaginary or real love with a man before she falls to die in bed. In the fourth scene, all the town sounds with bells and in noisy fiesta. The last scene is the murder of Pedro Páramo by one of his sons, Abundio. The end goes back to the beginning, where Comala's ghost sounds remain in the nocturnal ambience. And transmutation between life and death. The perception of the opera should create the image of a world made of single parts which never link. The process of death in Rulfo's novel is not completed, and also is not possible to define when it began. Probably is the same as in the Mictlan. The reader is constantly affected by the transmutation of these two different stages of the soul, one in a discontinuum of reality, trapped in a human body, and the second in a continuum of space with no sensation of time, in the infraworld. For this stage of the soul, Estrada applied 12 speakers that surround the audience, creating a three-dimensional moving space in a transmutation between life and death, where sounds coming from the upper part belong to reality, and those coming from the lower one belongs to the infra world. Estrada understands the transmutations in Rulfo's narrative by the sonority of time, the geniality to manipulate the events and when they occur, sometimes in fast running, other passive and pause. This element is of strong importance in Estrada operas, constantly going and returning in time, in a continuum of micro-transits of several components of sound. A series of short independent musical models come together to build a non-per-structure superimposition of different moments, where each element flows with its own time and tendency. The architecture is similar to Rulfo's novel structure, made of series of almost short segments. The score is similar to a three-dimensional puzzle, but not only for the interpretation of the parts for singers and instrumentalists, also for the conception of the integration in a three-dimensional space of interaction with the audience in a macro timbre. Estrada achieved this transmutation by multiplying new trajectories in opera, as it explained by Estrada. Octave voice complemented by singing. Without any word, the chant becomes emotive meaning of words. Almost each instrumental part represents a character which becomes a musical expansion, a double of a singer. Recorded environmental sounds are complemented by live noisemaker transformations in such manner that there is no border between both kinds of sound. Dramatic action is doubled by independent parallel actions. For instance, the dramatic solo for guitar in parallel to Susana's mad voice. Dramatic action, vocal and instrumental, are complemented or even alternates in the meaning with the butoh dance movements. Scenic continuity is made of series of different moments floating in different times and space. Scenic representation at the front of the listener is complemented by surrounding him with waves of moving sounds. All this at the operatic level is a macro construction of the macro perception, a notion similar to the macro timbre, which Estrada developed, built by rhythm and sound space structure in music. The musical works in the opera. The whole musical work is an ensemble integrated by segments that are independent from each other. The process of creation for the opera was built during 14 years of experimentation, several forms in the macro timbre, special for vocal parts, where he could expand all the possible parameters that can be obtained by the use of the voice. Whispering, snoring, babbling, screaming, gargling are just some of multiply parameters that Estrada could achieve and synthesize in his opera. The complete series of 7 modules of Murmullos del Páramo constitute the complete elements to build the opera. All these elements are not by one and one. All are mixed between just a few parts, Mictlan, then start Itzictlan, and can be combined in several ways, like in the novel of Rulfo. Mictlan is a piece that is separated by 2 pieces that could perform together or not. Miki Cihuatl for female voice and Miki Nahual for double bass. The marriage of both pieces gives us a result, the transmutation between one's life and death, expressed by a dramatical lament, the sound of all characters involved in the novel, the eternal suffering of the labyrinth of death, together with moving of power and powerful episode in a music for double bass, symbolizing the demoniacal transmutation of a human body into a supernatural animal. I would like to show an example with music. I must disconnect the audio from here, sorry. So. Whom, for 3 female voices and 2 male voices, is a connection between 2 parts of the opera, offers a continuum of the action. The title expressed by itself the intention that the composer had to include in such role, according to Estrada, the Mayan term for Murmullos, whisper, the original title to Rulfo's novel. The absence of text is absorbed by laments and whisperings of lost transiting into the Mictlan. A little example of the score. I couldn't achieve all score to show now. We can have Okay. So what is for text in the novel is for music in the opera, the complete transmutation from reality to surrealism that the music and declamation express in the opera were the intentions of Estrada to achieve the sounds expressions of Rulfo's novel. In the macro form of the word, it is also expressed this mutation. The first part is made with parallel interaction between voice and murmurs. In contrast, the second part is the voice are gradually lost until just a few fragments of words by Susanna are sensibly eliminated until it's only music what is left. With these two opposing images of the opera, Estrada deals with a highly expressive treatment, the fusion between this continuum and continuum. Susanna's murmurs are in continuum, flexibility and elasticity, an echo that comes from very far away in the mid of Quetzalcoatl. In contrast, the voice of Bartolome, Susanna's father, expressed in this continuum as a reference to human rigidity. And just, I would like to speak who is Estrada, a few words about him. This is a Mexican composer. He finished his studies in France by tuition Oliver Messiaen. And after time to finish his work with him, he expressed for me, I took it like the best way to expose his base of intuition to create any piece of art. Can be music, paint, literature, because he likes to concentrate also in writing, literature, and also painting. So this is his statement. Sorry. Stop to compose and begin to create an essay without corrections in order to transform the imaginary into a new musical reality, open to stumble and close to certainty. The opera Murmullos del Páramo is by this time his most representative work in the creation of new music, a synthesis of this continuum amalgamating myth, poetry, and sound, synthesis of his inner musical reality. Well, if someone would like to hear by his own voice how he explains the process, there is a documental. I have a part that I can show. If not, so we can finish now. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel, for a very interesting introduction to the opera. Do we have any questions for Manuel? Yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I was curious about the contrasting temporal flows that you were suggesting exist in the opera. It seemed that there was a dichotomy between the underworld and the overworld to an extent, right? And you mentioned that it seemed that temporal flow was somewhat stationary in the underworld sections. Excuse me if I'm simplifying.
Yes.
It's basically on point. So my curiosity is, well, the scores you showed us are completely unmetered, so I was curious if there is any metrical flow to the overworld.
Well, no, there is no any type of metric idea in music, in Estrada's music.
So then my follow-up question would be then, so how is the contrast made?
Made? You mean the time? The time.
Temporal contrast.
Oh, when I was speaking about at the time, I was speaking how he connect with the novel. That also in the novel there is now a sensation of time, how things happen. When you start to read the novel, you don't know that people are dead. In fact, you start to know this later, but then in the novel appear also that they are alive. So there is a constant transmutation of time between life and death, yes? You don't know where they are dead and where they are alive. So Estrada applies the same methodology. He's moving these 12 speakers up and down. He's moving the sounds constantly, like going where it's alive, the reality, and then when it's the underworld. So the people, let's say, when you go to the opera to see this opera, it's not that the scenario is in front of you, but you are surrounded by the scenario. So you are inside the Mictlan, let's say, yes, and you can feel this transmutation of time that you don't know where exactly are when things are happening. In that point, I was speaking on time, not on metric. Sorry.
Oh, sure. Thank
Sorry.
you.
Thank you for the presentation. I would like to know whether Estrada elaborated on this idea, stopped composing and start creating. How does he contrast composing as opposed to creating?
Because for he compose, he translate like there is a chain of already methods established when we are as composer. We must go into a theory that takes us a system, and this system gives us a style. So he wants to break this connection because for him it's always get tied to a tradition established by you must do things in this way, or you must treat the harmony in this way, or metric, whatever. So he wants to break this chain, and before the theory he puts the imagination and the rationality at the end, and these 2 points are all the time combining. Yeah, so he works mainly in the imagination as his own intuition tells him what the sounds are, how he feels the sounds, which colors, which texture, dynamics, and so on.
So given the topic of this conference, it could translate it as ratio versus intuition, or?
Yes,
Well.
yes. I mean, I think it's the perfect translation.
Very good, thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Yeah, lady at the back.
Thank you very much. And I don't know, this is a good question in this place, but I'm curious about representation, about audience, how often they show this multi-opera and how people react to this opera.
Yeah, well, the first presentation was in Spain, in Madrid, in 2014, I guess. Yeah, 2014. It was well received, warm, because in fact Estrada has relatives from Spain. His fathers are they emigrate to Mexico in the Franco era, so he has a lot of relatives in Spain. There was a lot of help from the radio in Spain, so they could help him. Then it was performed in France a year later, and there the audience was very upset about the treatment of these things of death, the contrabass, the idea that a contrabass is lying on the table representing the a dead human body of Juan Preciado. So what we are listening, this double bass is a double bass lay on a table, and a person with 2 bows manipulating the sound. It was not so well received. Then in Mexico, finally, a year later, again was performed, and there Estrada felt, and he says that this is the place where the opera should be, because of maybe the tradition. It was very well received. After that was performed in Japan also, and China, and in Italy also as well. So it's not like a few performances, quite known already.
Any other questions? No? Thank you very much, Manuel.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So next, it's a pleasure to welcome Mark Vuorinen. Is that how you say your name? Sorry. Yep. From the University of Waterloo in Canada, who's going to talk to us about the intersection of intuitive and rational processes in the music of Arvo Pärt, who's very well known to us all, I'm sure. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you. It's good. Okay, thank you. Well, good morning.
Thank you very much to the organizers for this wonderful conference and for the invitation to be here. As my description or title suggests, I'll spend this morning talking about Arvo Pärt's Como cierva, sedienta, a Spanish setting of Psalms 42 and 43. And to begin, we'll just listen to about a 2.5-minute excerpt of the work so that you get a bit of a sense of how this work operates. The idea with which I began is addressed in the Principles of Music Composing conference description, and that is the phenomena of rationality and intuition are considered to be contrasting yet complementary poles in the compositional process. Much study has been done on Arvo Pärt's celebrated tintinnabile style and the methods by which the works in this musical language were composed. Works in this style, which have dominated his oeuvre since the late 1970s, in essence involve a two-voice texture. The first voice, which he refers to as the melody voice, is normally scalar and usually is limited, at least in the early works, to an octave or less. The second voice, called the tintinnabile voice, is entirely triadic and is normally attached compositionally to the melody voice. The process for attaching The tintinnabuli voice is worked out in the pre-compositional design of each piece, and at least with respect to his earlier works in this style, is followed fastidiously throughout the work. At the point of pre-composition, intuition presides, while rationality follows the prescribed process through to its end. Conductor and Pärt scholar Paul Hillier best defines the relationship and the fusing of the two voices in his 1997 Oxford University Press biography of Pärt. He describes the intrinsic relationship shared by the melodic and tintinnabuli voices. And he says, quote, "The harmonic framework has been tilted sideways to form a musical line, and the relationship between two different kinds of melodic movement creates a harmonic resonance, which is essentially the triad, and fluctuating attendance of diatonic dissonances. What we hear might best be described as a single moment spread out in time," unquote. In this example from his 1982 work, Passio, one can see this relationship play out between the tenor, the tintinnabuli voice, and the bass, the melody voice. Many authors, including me, have ascribed theological meaning and symbolic significance to Pärt's fastidious pre-compositional design and methods of composition. But what happens when Pärt seemingly breaks free of the traditional tools of the tintinnabuli language, as he did in a substantial 1999 work for solo soprano or unison women's chorus and full orchestra? Como cierva sedienta is a Spanish setting of Psalms 42 and 43 and is a decided move away from the codified procedures of tintinnabuli common to the 1980s. The orchestral colors are at times rich and warm, with far more expansive use of harmony than previously experienced. Alex Ross, the music critic of the New Yorker magazine, describes this piece as having, quote, "a strikingly vibrant, almost Fauvist orchestration and a richly ornamented vocal line. It is very nearly opulent," unquote. Said in relation to the music of many other composers, this statement might well go unnoticed, but Pärt's music has never been accused of opulence. This statement suggests something very new in his music. This is a Matisse painting titled Sorrow for the King. Ross is recalling the strongly colored paintings of Henri Matisse and André Derain as a visual parallel to Pärt's music in this particular piece. This reference to the visual arts by Alex Ross refers first and foremost to the expanse of orchestral color present in this work. However, more importantly, the increased color of the sonic experience is directly related to a softening of the tintinnabuli procedures and expansion of new process-driven compositional technique. This softening allows for a more varied harmonic language. To be sure, signs of the old Pärt are still present. Conjunct melody lines largely define the sung material, while orchestral voices are often inextricably paired with triadic tintinnabuli voices. The monochordal use of tintinnabuli of earlier years, however, has been expanded, now moving between multiple tonal centers. Immediately, a listener recognizes the expanded tonal palette. Interestingly, Pärt himself recognizes somewhat sheepishly his move away from the strict procedures of the earlier tintinnabuli music in this quotation, again from the article by Alex Ross. The composer acknowledged his latest tendencies with a guilty smile. "Yes," he said, "I got a little crazy, didn't I?" He mimed a gesture that suggested a flamenco dancer throwing tennis balls, unquote. The distance traveled by Pärt from the strictly controlled tintinnabuli procedures of Passio to the greatly expanded tonal palette of Como cierva sedienta didn't occur all at once, of course. Rather, the continued development of this composer's music, like so many other composers, moves along a continuum. At times, the continuum moves away from strict procedures towards greater compositional freedom. At other times, Pärt looks back, seeming to entrench the process-driven practices of his past, but in new ways. This paper uses my analysis of Como cierva sedienta as the basis of a discussion revealing the ways in which the composer has eschewed his traditional tintinnabuli methods to link text to music, only to replace them with a series of new, more intricate practices, each of which in their own way integrally connect these sacred words to the Psalms, integrally connect these sacred words of the Psalms to the orchestral music that surrounds them. Guided by the inflection of the Spanish text, he has designed procedures similar to those of earlier works to guide the creation of a vocal line, or M voice, but has developed entirely new mechanisms to generate the orchestral material that accompanies it. In some cases, the mechanisms can be observed within every note and every phrase, and at other times it is observed that the process at work is only visible from a greater distance. Nevertheless, these pre-compositional devices infuse a work rich in color, orchestration, and tonality, resulting in a piece that sets a new benchmark. In earlier works, it was observed that the composer found sufficient musical food in the simplest seeds of a single triad and scale. In Como Cierva Sedienta, however, Pärt defines the musical setting of each verse of biblical text with a discrete musical texture and orchestration, thereby painting the text to a greater extent than previously seen. The methods vary dramatically from one verse to the next, resulting in a highly colorful and tonally variant work. The inversion of a melody voice, or M voice, has long been one of Pärt's primary tools of textural development. In Como Cierva Sedienta, however, inversion takes on new roles, heard in a variety of forms. The opening of the third movement is a good example of how Pärt embeds text into the orchestral fabric through the use of an inversion canon. In this excerpt, a conjunct melody voice shaped by Spanish inflection related to the accented and unaccented syllables and vowel sounds, such as diphthongs, delivers the text of Psalm 42, verse 6. A second M voice is heard played by the cello. This melody is an inversion canon of the soprano line at the unison and is delayed by one beat. The interval of inversion also starts anew with the beginning of every new word. You might notice that single-syllable words are not treated according to the inversion canon. That first syllable, may, doesn't take part in this canon. Only multi-syllable words do. To add to this texture, Pärt pairs this melody and its inversion with two tintinnabile voices in F minor, heard in the first and second violins. The T voice in the first violin is attached directly to the soprano M voice and plays according to a three-note pattern in first position, alternating for every word of text. The first two tintinnabile pitches fall on the accented syllable of each word, while the third is heard during the final unaccented syllable of text. This treatment is consistent. Single-syllable words are not accompanied by either an inversion canon or by the tintinnabile pitches. The T voice in the second violin is attached to the inversion canon of the cello and offers only one pitch, also in first position alternating, during what corresponds to what would be the accented syllable of the word being inverted by the cello. These same measures of music as above, or in the previous slide, are now shown here. This inversion canon then wordlessly shadows the M voice of the soprano, thereby embedding the text into the orchestral fabric, while the familiar sounds of the T voice silhouette the poetic inflection of the Spanish text. Inversion in this form is found accompanying several verses of the text throughout this work. In another example of the M voice pitch cont creating inverted orchestral gestures, we can look to the end of movement 4. Beginning with the words of Psalm 42, verse 11, the composer creates 4 quasi-brass chorales, each of which separate the textual phrases of this verse. Each of the passages contains traditional M and T voice-like relationships, as well as elements that are not part of that language. To compose the M voice for the first passage in the brass chorale, Pärt reverses the melody pitches of the soprano's last word, desanimarme. This retrograde melody, you can see the soprano chorus line in the bottom staff, and then the brass chorale follows with the following 4 measures. This retrograde melody is played by the second trumpet and is doubled a sixth lower by horns 2 and 4. An inversion of the retrograde melody is also present as a third melody voice in this passage, trombone 1, and in turn the retrograde inversion is also doubled a sixth lower, trombone 3. The passage has two T voices in G major, which are attached to the M voice transpositions, horn and trombone, and a rhythmic gesture of 16th note triplets creates a contrasting element to the sustained chords heard in the rest of the instruments. This pitch content of this repeated figure outlines the contour of the inverted M voice. In Como cierva, sedienta, Pärt relies less on the use of a traditional T voice than in many earlier works. When one is present, however, it contributes to Alex Ross's impression of Fauvist opulence, in part because the composer uses as many as 9 different chords, including on a number of occasions a diminished triad and a diminished 7th chord, which add tonal variety to an already unusual work. But there are several new ways in which the composer attaches pitch content to the text through their association to the M voice in ways that mirror the tintinnabile approach. In the second movement of the work, an extraordinary passage of new compositional mechanisms is begun, setting the words of Psalm 42, verse 5. The M voice rises and falls according to its poetic stress or inflection, while a second stratum of music is heard in the remaining string parts. In tintinnabile-like fashion, pitch classes a diatonic third away from the M voice are alternated above or below. That's represented on the lower staff there in the strings. Right. In tintinnabile-like fashion, pitch classes a diatonic third away from the M voice are alternated above or below. In this way, Pärt has created a gesture that, by its attachment to the M voice, follows tintinnabile-like rules. The new voice alternates with regularity and maintains rigorous adherence to the rules set for its use. At the same time, the new voice offers greater harmonic variety than a T voice in the traditional sense, since the pitches are not connected to a single triad, but rather are always found a diatonic third away from the M voice. In the phrase shown, all 7 pitches of the mode are used at least once. At the same time, Pärt also attaches 2- and 3-note instrumental motives to the pitches of this same M voice. In this slide, the motives are shown as assigned by Pärt next to the M voice pitch to which they are attached. So in any case that an A flat, the first example here, is used in the melody voice, one of those 2 little 16th note gestures accompanies it in one of the instrumental parts. It is further observed that there are 2 motives for each M voice. The first is a group of 16th note triplets, and the second a pair of 16th notes. Pärt reserves the former for M voice pitches that coincide with accented syllables of text, including single-syllable words, and the latter are attached to non-accented syllables. An additional motive of 3 16th notes following a 16th note rest is assigned to words whose accent falls on its final syllable. The instrumentation for these motives also follows a predetermined plan. The triplet 16th motive is played by the oboe and clarinet in a pattern of 1 oboe motive followed by 2 clarinet motives. The motives associated with non-accented syllables are played by the piccolo. In this way, Pärt links textual inflection to both motivic pitch content and also orchestral timbre. The result of these overlapping musical elements is a new musical palette far richer in both harmonic and rhythmic variety than traditional tintinnabile. Yet the factors by which this music is controlled or governed are manufactured and managed in precisely the same way as Pärt's 1960s forays into serial music and the early tintinnabile music. Pärt develops this idea of attaching orchestral motives to M voice pitches in later verses, and the manner in which he assigns the various motives has a profound impact on the affect of the setting. For the treatment of Psalm 42, verse 7, in the third movement, Pärt makes use of a full orchestration of woodwinds, brass, percussion, and strings. The melodic material, or M voice, is once again governed by the text, and in turn, the M voice controls the pitch and rhythmic content of the accompanying material. First, the text is treated in a consistent and formulaic manner. Single-syllable words are set as quarter notes, and multisyllable words are treated according to where the natural word stress lies. In this passage, accented syllables of text are always given a two-note setting where the first note is a quarter note and the second note always a half note. The two notes moving in stepwise motion can either ascend or descend, and when a final unstressed syllable follows, it is set as a half note and repeats the second pitch of the two-note stressed syllable setting. If there are more than one or more syllables at the beginning of the word before the stressed syllable, they are set as quarter notes and approach the stressed syllable pitches in conjunct motion. And the orchestral material throughout this section also rigorously maintains a pattern according to the text it accompanies. 4 orchestral gestures attached to various parts of the text according to its poetic inflection. In the same way, the M voice is governed by the placement of stressed and unstressed syllables. The orchestral gestures are also attached to the M voice according to its word stress. In this way, Pärt echoes his older tintinnabile works in which the M voice material exclusively governs the way in which T voices are used. The same general principles are at play here, though the content has changed dramatically. As in other parts of the piece, single-syllable words receive no additional treatment. So the 3 beats it takes for a stressed syllable to be sung are treated instrumentally exactly the same way for each of the 10 multisyllable words found in this verse, and with each 3 different gestures occur. Number 1, for the first 2 beats, 2 seventh chords built on the M voice pitch are articulated in 2 ways. They are heard as solid chords articulated by 4 instruments. At the same time, the chord is also expressed in triplets spread throughout the strings and woodwind instruments. A melodic tritone is heard in the trumpet to close the treatment of a stressed syllable. These 3 elements accompany each and every stressed syllable of text. The pitch content is directly related to the pitch classes of the M voice, and in each case, the pitch of the melody becomes the root of the 7th chord, which is heard in a manner described above. The tritone heard as 2 triplet 8th notes in the trumpet is likewise comprised of 2 pitches from the 7th chord heard 1 beat earlier. For final, unaccented syllables in the same word, a separate instrumental gesture is heard. Again, a 7th chord is built using the M voice pitch as a root. In this case, the pitches are distributed using a sextuplet figure of repeated pitches heard in 2 or more instruments. The sextuplet figure and M voice pitch itself always last 2 beats, and for these final unaccented syllables of text. A secondary gesture is also present on final unaccented syllables for the first half of the verse. The second oboe plays a note of the B-flat minor triad at the same time as the unaccented syllable is heard. This note has a typical and predictable tintinnabile relationship to the melody note to which it is attached, although its use is more discrete as it's only heard in measures 3, 6, 8, 10, and 14 of this section of the piece. It's always found in the first position superior. The last orchestral gesture heard in this second section of the 3rd movement occurs when 1 or more unstressed syllables of a word precede the accented syllable of the same word. Here, the pitch is accompanied by a scalar passage which follows the overall contour of the M voice. If the M voice ascends to the next pitch, the scalar passage also ascends, and vice versa. In almost all cases, the scale begins on a pitch 1/3 above or below the M voice pitch, depending on the direction of motion. Rhythmically, the scale is set as a non-tuplet of 9 32nd notes. If there is more than 1 unaccented syllable, a scalar passage appears attached to each of them. An example of this sort is An example of this sort of setting occurs on the word atronador, which means thunderous, whose accented syllable is found at the end of the word. There are 3 scalar gestures, 1 for each of the 3 unstressed syllables of text. In this slide, each constituent part of the orchestration is represented and reduced to 2 staves. Pärt is rigorous about maintaining the rules set out from the outset with respect to accented and unaccented syllables. The following reduction of measures 17 and 18 is typical of this verse's setting, and this is part of the excerpt that we heard at the beginning of the discussion. Textually, the music that follows shares many of the same rules of engagement as that which precedes it. Pärt continues to use the concept of orchestral gestures being attached to M voice pitches based on their word stress. In verse 8, the gestures are decidedly different in character than the preceding verse. There is a greater emphasis on sustained and legato gestures, keeping in line with the meaning of the text. Typical examples of each type of accompaniment are shown in this slide in each measure. The text de dia represents a single syllable word, a stressed syllable, and an unaccented final syllable. The approach Pärt takes in setting verses 7 and 8 of Psalm 42 are virtually the same. Orchestral gestures are created for each of the 4 kinds of word stress present: single syllable words, unaccented syllables coming before a strong syllable, accented syllables, and final unaccented syllables in the text. Pärt is fastidious about applying the gestures to the M voice throughout the 2 verses. Clearly, the musical materials have changed, but the process of attaching gestures to the M voice pitches has its roots in the process-driven compositions of Pärt's earlier works. While the affect of verse 7 and verse 8 are very different from one another, the concepts for attaching them remain identical. Here, it seems Pärt makes a nod to word painting in a way that has not been observed in such an apparent manner before. Verse 7, with its scalar passages, jarring triplets, melodic tritones, and sextuplets on unaccented final syllables, is a clear reference to the thunder, waves, and billows found in that text. This music can be compared to the relatively sedate and sustained motives composed to create the accompaniment to the words of Psalm 42, verse 8. Given the remarkably similar process used to compose the 2 verses, it is striking that Pärt chose to so obviously paint the text of these 2 verses with such differing accompanimental motives side by side. It can be recalled in Passio, for instance, that more than an hour of music passes by without so much as a change of harmony in the tintinnabile voice, making the narrative of Christ's arrest, trial, and crucifixion sound remarkably similar for an extended period of time. In Como cierva sedienta, Arvo Pärt set off into new musical territory. The examples shown here today are but a few of many ways Pärt has made this work unique to his oeuvre, with new and more complex pre-compositional processes, expanding his tonal language. Elements of his earlier tintinnabile music are surely present. However, it is clear that it is the new processes observed throughout the work that drive its creation. Guided by the inflection of the Spanish text, Pärt designed mechanisms to generate orchestral material. In some cases, the mechanisms can be observed within every note and phrase, and other times it's observed that the process at work is only visible from a greater distance. Nevertheless, these pre-compositional devices are responsible for a work rich in color, orchestration, and tonality. Referring to Como cierva sedienta, the composer quipped to Alex Ross of The New Yorker, "Yes," he said, "I got a little crazy, didn't I?" Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Do we have any questions? I've got a quick question.
Great.
Do you have any thoughts about how these sort of more micro-scale processes relate to the larger scale form of the work?
I'm not sure they do entirely. It's a very curious work because if you know the work of Pärt, his music has been so fastidious, through so much of his career that it's very predictable. You can, if you know the rules that he's playing by, you can fairly accurately predict what's going to happen 4 or 5 pages down the road. Quite often in work like Passio, where it's to a T. This work, on the other hand, it changes so often, and as I began to study it, the quote by Alex Ross, "I got a little crazy, didn't I?" just seems to be so apt because his method changes so often that gestures that he creates for one verse, they don't come back in another verse later on. They're really discreetly used in that particular moment for that moment in time, and that's it. And then he moves on to something else. And the overall arching sort of form, it doesn't piece together in a logical kind of way that you see in so many of his works. They're very discrete. 1, 2, 3, each are very different. So I'm not sure that they do kind of relate overall to the big picture of the piece.
Right. Okay. Thanks. Any further questions? Oh, yeah, we have one here.
Maybe a question about reception. Often in the talk, I got a little crazy, didn't I, and talked about expanded palette. There are a lot of words that have positive vibe forming. Is the piece accepted by performers? It seems to be a choir that goes into Pärt's verb and looks for something to sing. Probably isn't looking for this. And, well, anyway, I guess, is it performed? That's my question.
Not really. I mean, it was performed in 1998. It was recorded shortly thereafter. Sometimes it is performed by a solo soprano rather than a choir. It's an excruciatingly difficult soprano part, as you can hear. I mean, it sits at the top of the staff for a lot of the piece and ascends to high Cs. I don't have sopranos that like to spend a lot of time there, so it's difficult. It's a difficult piece to program, and it's not typical of Pärt. And so I think Pärt's reception, while it's been enormous worldwide, it's the music of the earlier periods that typically get performed more often. And this is not 20 years has passed since he wrote this piece, 20 years has passed since he wrote this piece, and he hasn't returned to anything like this again. If anything, he's gone backwards, not backwards, I don't mean that negatively, but back to earlier styles of his composition.
About the, you mentioned the tying of the accents of the words to the melodic writing. Mm-hmm. Did you detect anything really specific about that? Is there a specific rule that he followed or anything like that?
Just that, he... So in other works, Pärt refers a lot to the syntax of text. So in Passio, for example, there are nods to this kind of writing where accented syllables typically get longer note values, unaccented ones get shorter note values. This just seems to be, kind of blown up, this approach, right? That he's now not just lengthening the actual note of that sung text, but he's now attaching orchestral gestures to each one of those things. So he's kind of expanded it. Does that answer the question you're asking? Yeah. Okay.
Any further questions? No. Okay. Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you.
So it's time for a much-needed coffee, and we resume again at 12 o'clock. So welcome back. Hopefully we're all caffeined up and ready to go. It's a pleasure now to welcome Stephen Guokas from the University in Cincinnati.
Good afternoon. Before I begin, I just want to say a big thanks to the Lithuanian Academy of Music and Theater for hosting this conference and for having us all here. I am a little nervous. I'm presenting about a Lithuanian composer to Lithuanians, so I apologize in advance for any mistakes or inaccuracies that might happen. A composer may naturally imbibe certain styles and approaches, but careful thought is necessary to integrate them into a larger whole, and much conscious study of musical technique is an inevitable part of the process. So writes Michael Beckerman in the opening pages of his seminal work regarding nationalism, New Worlds of Dvorak. This concept, that a composer might acquire naturally, subconsciously even, some musical trait of his or her own native music, leads directly into the concept of national music, that music can display specific characteristics that betray, or rather identify, its origin. Beckerman's continuation, however, that, quote, much conscious study of musical technique is an inevitable part of the process, leads naturally to the topic of this conference, namely how the rational and the intuitive, the conscious and the unconscious, the native experience and the conservatory education combine within a composition to form the whole. This paper examines just that within the De Profundis cantata of Mikalojus Konstantinas Čiurlionis. Why the De Profundis? It has long been established that Čiurlionis's two-tone poems, Mishka and Jura, are at least somewhat nationalist in nature. However, the De Profundis predates both of these by at least 2 years. Further, the cantata was written as Čiurlionis completed his studies at the Warsaw Conservatory, and can thus be viewed as his first mature work. Though he wrote music prior to the De Profundis, it is primarily comprised of student compositions. Finally, the cantata contains both vocal and instrumental music, allowing not only the ability to compare Čiurlionis's text setting with melodies and harmonies commonly found in Lithuanian folk song, and his other vocal works, including his folk song settings, Mass Ordinary and the Psalms, but also the opportunity to compare his orchestral writing with his nationalist tone poems, Mishka and Jura. Disclaimer, this paper is a severe reduction of a much larger work and thus offers just a sampling of the evidence of nationalist tendencies within the De Profundis. Before I begin to examine the piece, I would like to offer the briefest account of the composer's life up until he writes this cantata. Mikalojus Konstantinas Čiurlionis was raised in a musical household. His father, for a time, was a church organist in the town of Druskininkai, and his sister writes that when the relatives would visit, the family would often congregate together and sing Lithuanian folk songs. This is confirmed by Lithuanian musicologist Vytautas Landsbergis. He supports this when he writes both of Čiurlionis's parents knew many Lithuanian folk songs and loved to sing them around the home. Funded by the Polish prince Mikhail Ogiński, Čiurlionis studied composition, piano, and counterpoint at the Warsaw Conservatory, graduating in 1899. While at the conservatory, he wrote many piano works in the style of Chopin, a Mass Ordinary for counterpoint exercises, and other small student works. He completed the De Profundis cantata for his graduation in 1899. Elements of Lithuanian folk song can be found in nearly every facet of Čiurlionis's De Profundis cantata, and to streamline this analysis, I will walk through each category one at a time. I will begin with rhythm, both within the choral setting and the orchestration, and move from there to melodic construction. Finally, a brief examination of harmony will be presented, as well as arguments for why certain characteristics can be considered Lithuanian. Rhythm is very important within Lithuanian folk music, particularly a long, short, long, dotted rhythm, especially when presented as an ostinato. You can see figure 1 on the screen. In the De Profundis, Trelonus wastes no time in displaying this feature. Indeed, the first choral sections present the long, short, dotted rhythm pair in the initial statements of the soprano, alto, and tenor voices, measures 7 and 8. As if to emphasize this point, Trelonus further presents these 3 voices homorhythmically, so that the listener cannot help but identify this hallmark of Lithuanian folk music. This rhythm is found throughout the piece. Trelonus uses it in no fewer than 6 additional times, and by employing this rhythm, he clearly harkens back to the folk songs he would have heard in his youth. Further, both Trelonus in his later writings, Apie Musica, and modern musicologists such as Danute Stashkevičius identify this rhythm as being a hallmark of Lithuanian folk song, and one can find this rhythm in works from the entirety of Trelonus's compositional career, such as the setting of Psalm 29 in 1898 and Psalm 66 in 1899, Opus 8 for piano from 1901, and even his final compositions, such as Opus 33 for piano, completed in 1909. Indeed, within Opus 33, Trelonus uses this rhythm throughout all voices and tessituras, ensuring that the listener will clearly hear and identify it as an aspect of Lithuanian folk music. Beyond the writings of Trelonus and Stashkevičius, however, how can one be sure that this rhythm can or should be interpreted through a nationalist lens? The simple solution is to examine Lithuanian folk song itself, and a cursory glance through any folk song collection allows one to see that this rhythmic motif, or something very similar, can be found in much of Lithuanian folk music. For example, Subatos vakareli, kaimes augom, ne tevežiniškeli, kare vežulis, and Berštani, Aušrašeli, to name a few. In total, this long-short rhythm appears in approximately 1/3 of Trelonus's own folk song arrangements. In addition to the long-short dotted pair, another characteristic rhythm of Lithuanian folk song is monotony, often presented as a consecutive collection of eighth notes that move homorhythmically and homophonically within each voice. Trelonus himself identifies this within his writing, Apie Musica. He writes, quote, "Even the unaccustomed ear of a foreigner will immediately sense a certain monotony of our rhythm." Within his folk song settings, one can find this musical trait in Prapoalo Mochute, Ganoaveles, Angstyrita Kelau, and others. Further, both Trelonus and musicologist Daiva Rationality consider this an important characteristic of Lithuanian folk music, and its presence within the De Profundis cantata is neither disguised nor hidden. Although Trelonus first presents this string of eighth notes within the vocal parts, measures 30 through 33 and 40 to 46, the voices do not move homorhythmically until measures 47 to 48 in the alto, tenor, and bass voices. This technique appears again in the alto, tenor, and bass in measures 66 through 68, and in measures 68 to 72, the soprano finally joins the other three voices. Trelonus's psalm settings confirm this to be a musical trait that he knew intrinsically. In both the homophonic and fugal sections of his Psalm 29, Trelonus presents these strings of eighth notes with a syllabic text setting in measures 9 through 12, similar to that employed here. Nationalist concepts within the orchestral rhythm of the piece closely mimic that are identified within the choral sections. For example, the opening bassoon motive, displayed in figure 3, demonstrates a sort of long, short rhythm so commonly found in Lithuanian folk song. It must be noted, however, that the long, short motive is not simply found in individual orchestral parts, but also employed by the entire orchestra, for example, in measures 29 and 30. See figure 4 on the screen. The rhythm employed as such is truly unavoidable. It is even marked fortissimo, and constitutes part of Čiurlionis' imbibed Lithuanian folk song style, as Beckerman would mark. A note, this long-short theme is also found within the second theme of his tone poem Mishka, and you can see a comparison on the screen. So on the top there we have the De Profundis, the main theme, which is just the shortened fragment, the dotted rhythm there. And in Mishka you see the dotted rhythm used in a descending figure in the second theme from that tone poem. Within Čiurlionis' writings, a great deal of time is spent discussing melody. As mentioned prior, in his writings he exhorts young composers to use a limited melodic range, writing that a truly Lithuanian song should contain, quote, a simple melody that does not expand across the entire octave, often making do with 4 or 5 notes, end quote. Throughout the majority of Čiurlionis' folk-inspired compositions, this limited melodic range is evident, and the De Profundis is no exception. Figure 6, displayed on the screen, shows the melody of the first vocal phrase of the work, measures 6 through 9. Note that throughout the imitative phrase, the melody moves only a perfect fourth. Further, each subphrase is even more limited in scope, moving only a major or minor third. One can also find this limited melodic range throughout Čiurlionis' folk song settings, including Kaimes Augom and Linelis. Regarding authenticity, an examine of folk song transcriptions by Stasys Šimkus confirms that Čiurlionis accurately portrays this characteristic of Lithuanian folk music. Within a polyphonic work, harmony is perhaps the most important complete musical characteristic. Now, the rhythmic variety and the melodic construction are examined together as a single whole. Regarding harmony, Čiurlionis' De Profundis demonstrates a hallmark of Lithuanian folk song, an abundance of major seconds. Rūta Gaidamavičiūtė, in her article Folk Songs in the Work of Lithuanian Composers, focuses on the first aspects, the treatment of a major second. Gaidamavičiūtė writes that this interval is commonly found within the Lithuanian folk song genre, the sutartinė, and that it often leads to bitonality within these pieces. While the De Profundis by no means contains bitonality, the presence of these parallel seconds can be viewed as an unconscious decision made by Čiurlionis that reflects his musical heritage, namely Lithuanian folk music. Figure 7, displayed on the screen, identifies one such moment where this occurs. When Čiurlionis does employ a consonant major second, or its compound equivalent, the ninth, it is often used as the voices have either static or parallel motion. He thus presents this interval as a noticeable feature that clearly recalls Lithuanian folk song. And if you look at the screen, you can see it should be boxed in red. The first time presented in the alto and the soprano parts throughout the vocal section, and later in the soprano and alto parts, but then also moving into parallel ninths between all 4 parts briefly in that measure. The prominence of the major second in the De Profundis is not anomalous. Within Čiurlionis' folk song settings, one can discern a use of the interval to identify the sound as Lithuanian. Further, within other Lithuanian folk song collections and transcriptions, such as those of Antanas Šimkus, this interval is employed with some regularity. It can also be found within Čiurlionis' other psalm settings and other vocal works, dating from later in his career. The orchestral harmony throughout the piece is slightly more difficult to label. Throughout the De Profundis, Trellonis seems to prefer standard late Romantic progressions to folk song harmony. This should not be surprising, however, as the Lithuanian folk music that Trellonis would have heard is primarily vocal in nature, and his idolization of Richard Strauss's tone poems during his conservatory days betray his preference for a lush, late Romantic orchestration. Trellonis' use of lush, late Romantic orchestration within the De Profundis is just one example of the ratio, the carefully crafted aspect of composition that exists within this work. Allow me to play the opening orchestral passage for you. Did you notice the orchestration? This would not have been out of fashion for other late Romantic composers, including the early works of Gustav Mahler or Richard Strauss, or the late period of Franz Liszt or his tone poems, among others. Indeed, throughout the work, Trellonis' employment of the orchestra is primarily Romantic in nature. Within the vocal section, one sees a distinct contrast between Trellonis' folk-inspired chorale-like sections and the fugal parts with which they alternate. And permit me to play a portion beginning at measure 31. The contrapuntal technique utilized by Trellonis here is reminiscent of his Mass setting and portions of his other psalm settings, which were completed as a set of counterpoint exercises during his time at the Warsaw Conservatory. Trellonis' use of counterpoint is not exclusive to the fugal sections of the De Profundis. For example, in measures 37 and 39, one finds that Trellonis treats his limited range melody, part of the Intuitio of this work, contrapuntally, thus marrying the imbibed style of the Lithuanian folk songs of his youth with the learned style of the conservatory. Regarding nationalist tendencies within the work, Trellonis makes the important conscious decision to set the text in Lithuanian. For Lithuanians, and for many other ethnic groups at this time, the issue of language and the unrestricted or official acceptance of their native tongues was a major victory, the lack of it a form of repression. For this reason, literary movements and the publication of national histories, poems, news, and other writings in the vernacular were vital to the establishment of any nationalist movement. Trellonis' decision to set his De Profundis text in Lithuanian thus expresses a conscious desire, part of the ratio, to present a major work in his homeland's native tongue. For its composition, he he used translations by the Polish poet Jan Kochanowski. Although the translations were in Polish, the language with which Čiurlionis was most familiar at the time, his decision to ultimately present the final work in Lithuanian clearly gives evidence of his nationalist tendencies. Further, this method of composition, working with a Polish translation of the Psalms and then translating the text into Lithuanian for the final draft, was common to Čiurlionis at this time. His other psalm settings from his conservatory days follow a similar construction process. And just a note, in each of Čiurlionis' early compositions, the Polish text is clearly seen throughout his sketches and autograph copies, which I consulted for this research, housed at the MK Čiurlionis National Museum and Archives in Kaunas, Lithuania. Mikalojus Konstantinas Čiurlionis is the quintessential Lithuanian composer, and for good reason. Though this presentation has touched on only one of his many compositions, I hope that I have demonstrated that even from his earliest mature compositions, that is, works not written simply for conservatory class exercise, Čiurlionis naturally expresses aspects of the Lithuanian folk music he would have heard as a child. For Čiurlionis, this Lithuanianness, Intuitio, combined itself inseparably with his conservatory training, the ratio, to create a truly Lithuanian style of composition, a style that many other of my colleagues have identified within his later works. For Čiurlionis, then, and for Lithuania, a national style is truly born out of a marriage of soul and mind, intuito et ratio. Thank you.
Stephen, thank you very much for that very interesting presentation. Do we have any questions?
Thank you. You've identified long, short, long as a characteristic rhythm, as sort of as a Scotch snap would be for Scottish music.
Sure.
So this is with Lithuania. I have to admit, it occurred to me that when I think of long, short, long, the Polonaise
Sure.
is another possibility. And Čiurlionis was Polish speaking.
Mm-hmm.
Any connection?
So part of that is history. Lithuania and Poland were part of the same kingdom, Grand Duchy, for hundreds of years. I have no doubt that musical traditions and musical characteristics would have been shared between this combined kingdom, this combined Grand Duchy. Beyond that, this work is coming at the end of his conservatory days, and so some of the ratio, the learned style, some of what he would have heard throughout the conservatory, I'm sure would be coming in, and so hearing a Polonaise, he probably would have gone, oh, that sounds like something my mother and father used to sing, or that sounds like something my relatives used to sing, and maybe would have hearkened back to some of the folk music he heard as a child and used it throughout that. But the best thing I can say is Poland and Lithuania shared rulers for hundreds of years. It is not surprising, and Čiurlionis himself, growing up middle class, primarily spoke Polish actually around the home. And it's interesting to look at his sketches and his autographs, because in the earlier years, almost all of the notes are in Polish, because that's what he's most familiar with. And then when he takes classes at the Leipzig Conservatory, some of them are in German, because that is the German and Polish then are what he's using as he's studying music early in his career, I guess. I hope that answers your question. If you have more questions later, I certainly have a substantial body of research I can talk to you about. Yes.
I'd just like to So to give a comment on your question and your answer. Actually, it happens all the time, not between Lithuania and Poland, but it's very often the case that certain group of people, certain ethnicity holds something to be exclusively theirs, whereas in fact it has a much wider range and I wouldn't say really universal, but you know, my ethnomusicologist colleagues would say that if they have no other information, they just hear the music and are asked to guess where it comes from, they could miss the whole continent. You can find amazing similarities between, let's say, Serbian ritual music and music in Central Flores in Indonesia, where no connections were possible. So there are probably certain archetypal formula that have a much wider range than specific ethnicity or a region or historically connected group of people or anything.
Sure, and I hope, I mean, this presentation is a very small portion of a 100-plus page work on this, and the long-short rhythm is just one example of many. It just also happens to be one that is found in a substantial body of Lithuanian folk music, so that combined with the text, combined with other musical characteristics, lean it to be interpreted through a nationalist lens, even though the rhythm itself you can find throughout many different ethnicities. Thank you for the comment.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No, I think we're done. Thank you, Stephen. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So our next speaker is Katarzyna Bartosz. Sorry for my pronunciation. What was it? Sorry? Bartosz from Poland, who's going to talk to us about Stockhausen's Aus den 7 Tagen text, which Stockhausen himself described as intuitive music, of course. So it should be very interesting.
It was 1968, a year of many changes in the world. Time of Surveyor 7 landing on the moon, students' protests and demonstrations in Poland or France. Time of hippies, ecology, new religions. But for Stockhausen, this time was the time that his life has totally changed. Monika Pasiecznik, an author of a book about Stockhausen's Licht, wrote that 60s and 70s were the period of composer's emotional and artistic crisis, time of his greatest doubts. After a premiere of Kurzwellen, Stockhausen was waiting for his wife and children to come from USA to Germany, their home. But Mary Bauermeister sent him a letter in which she explained that their marriage is finished and that she wants a divorce. She was over his numerous and visible love affairs with other women. Stockhausen was trying to convince her, but it was worthless. He decided even to change her mind differently by a hunger strike and committing a suicide. As Pasiecznik wrote, for Bauermeister, Stockhausen's suicidal threats were only an attempt to put her under pressure, a kind of an emotional blackmail because of anger and fear of her decisive objection. While fasting, Stockhausen was asking himself, who am I? What are my life goals? And one day he found a book by Satprem about Sri Aurobindo. It was on his bookshelf for quite a long time, completely untouched. Sri Aurobindo was an Indian yogi, philosopher, and poet. He thought that above mind, which is the highest what the evolution reached by now, is supermind, eternal truth consciousness that is in its nature a self-aware and self-determining light and power of the divine knowledge. Only because of supermind one can become better, but it's possible by opening to a greater divine consciousness to rise to this power of light and bliss, discover one's true self, remain in constant union with the divine, and bring down the supermental force for the transformation of mind and life and body. Aforementioned philosophical texts were a godsend for Stockhausen's soul. As an author of composer's biography, Michael Coates claims, coming at a crisis point, the book with the text on Sri Aurobindo, was the impulse for a catharsis that immediately generated new music. Readings and fastings were the starting point for Stockhausen's writing. The short poems became later a content of a score, aus den 7 Tagen, from the 7 days. The piece opened a new chapter in composer's life, a professional as well as personal. The score consists of 15 compositions. Stockhausen did not write any musical note. Before we will take a closer look at the movements, we should understand what, according to Stockhausen, aus den 7 Tagen is. Stockhausen, to describe this new genre of music, used the term intuitive music. He claimed that it is not equal to the improvisation both in jazz, even in free jazz, and Eastern music. He said, "In intuitive music, I try to get away from anything that has established itself as musical style. In improvised music, there is always, as history has shown, some basic element, rhythmic or melodic or harmonic, on which the improvisation is based. But it also cannot be called totally aleatoric, as sometimes it is, because the composer gave many details which sound should be produced. The idea of the piece is to spontaneously create the piece according to a score, which is just a kind of source of mental preparation for a performer. This new music genre is based on a spiritual connection between members of the group. Texts just help them to meditate and get to a certain level of consciousness." The composer was aware that, in fact, a new generation of musicians has to be born and able to understand his music. He faced some problems when he wanted to perform for the first time aus den 7 Tagen. A couple of performers were thinking that writing poems is in fact not composing. There were also people not open to this new kind of musical experience. First performance, though, took place on 25th of November 1968. Now let us see the parts of the piece. Aus den 7 Tagen was composed between 7th and 11th of May 1968. Most of the movements were written on 8th of May. Each part has its own title. There is no information about which instrument or voice to play, nor which parts to choose or in which order to play this piece. Stockhausen said also that it is the best to perform this piece in small group. As he said, the best number is 4 or 5. Even with 6, in my opinion, one needs a lot of self-discipline to stop playing for relatively long periods of time during the performance, and to know exactly when the right moments has come, so that also solos and duos and trios occur, not just sextets all the time, so that we see that in fact he was contradicting himself. Außensiebentagen is not an example of total indeterminacy. There are many fragments of the piece in which one needs to play some rhythms, although the choice of them and how to perform them is open to a player. One has to have a kind of self-confidence and belief in what he or she is doing, since this is a piece that is created here and now by a group, and it is crucial to have an ability to listen carefully to others and to react to what they do. In richtige Dauern, one has to play and stop when he or she feels it should be stopped. In Intensität, it is required to play a single sound until the musician feels warmth in the whole body. Similarly, in Setz de Segel zur Sonne, one has to play a tone and focus on its harmonics, then listen to others playing their tones, blend with them, and come back to his or her tone. The idea is to create a complete harmony, and as it's written in the poem, and the whole sound turns to gold, to pure, gently shimmering fire. Also in Treffpunkt, musicians should meet in one tone. There are several moments of Außensiebentagen that they seem to be very similar. Stockhausen asked to play in the rhythm of some vibrations, then to mix them together. It is in Verbindung, Nachtmusik, Abweist, Aufwärts, and Kommunion. For example, in Verbindung, there are vibrations of the body, heart, breathing, thinking, intuition, enlightenment, and universe mentioned. Playing Außensiebentagen requires a lot of consciousness and imagination. It seems to be something both rational and intuitive. As Stockhausen said, the era of absolutism of thoughts is coming to an end, and with it the era of products of art, which in a growing way represent first of all products of human capacity to think. Since there are quite a lot of theoretical analysis of the piece, I would like to focus on more practical side of this, of the Außensiebentagen, and show how it looks like from the side of listener, a player, and a teacher. I consider every performance of Außensiebentagen as a very intimate time that one should experience while being with musicians, being connected to them. Therefore, I do not recommend to listen to the recording of this piece. This should be listening to the music here and now, experiencing each sound with no certainty what will happen. By listening to the recording, we assume that the performance already had place, and the music on the CD is yet gone. Also, we can perceive it as a total chaos. Intuitive music is very organic one. The music is being born, it lives and dies when it's finished. Of course, one can have such an experience while taking part in any performance, but mostly because of our knowledge of styles, forms, genres, etc., we somehow are not surprised by what happened and what will happen. We have some expectations. With intuitive music, one can get to a stage of deep or focused listening, and by that I understand listening with curiosity, but also with no certain expectations, letting the music guide us and forgetting the time. Some of the listeners indeed told me that the intuitive music was a new experience for them, and they felt like the music took them to another space, that time was endless. On a concert at Music Academy in Wrocław, on 23rd of November 2013, a performance of Außensiebentagen took place. It was during a festival called Startfest that was organized by two students, Agata Chojnacka and Monika Wasilewska. The group of performers was diverse. There was a composer, a student of secondary school, musician, and 3 theoreticians. Three pieces were performed: Richtige Dauern, Treffpunkt, and Verbindung. The instruments used during the performance were violin, viola, cello, contrabass, accordion, and electric guitar. The group was formed just for this occasion, and we didn't rehearse nor ever played together before. Some of us even didn't play for a long time, but we wanted to experiment. Although I am a violinist, I decided to play the viola that I just bought in order to experiment more, and as I found out, on viola I can produce more interesting effects. What I can say from my experience of playing this piece is that I do not remember what was happening, what I was playing and how the music ended. I just remember feeling connected to the people that were around me, reacting to what they do, and amazing freedom that I never felt before, that I can express myself freely. I use this piece on my lessons of analysis with music therapy students. I ask them to bring with them instruments that will help them to express them the most freely. After an introduction of what is the idea of intuitive music and the history of the creation of Aus den Sieben Tagen, we chose together two fragments and read it loudly. Then we turned the light off, had some time to think, and prepare to play. All of the students have used improvisation during their studies. They are working with patients using the improvisation, and they are using it also on lessons at the academy. But at the same time, most of them do not listen to new music nor like it. For all of them, playing intuitive music was something totally new. After the performance, they said it was very hard to get rid of harmonic and melodic thinking in order to blend with others and create the other harmony. We were playing Treffpunkt, and two of them, without any agreement made before, chose the same pitch to start with and did it at the same time. Students found out that the personalities of people playing, as well as the general feeling of the group, can be shown in intuitive music and also affect the performance. They claim that there are many factors that can change the performance: usage of light in the class or lack of it, the day, weather, feeling of doing something new and quite challenging, were what they said that influenced them. I see the more a group is opened to new music and generally to new musical experiences, the better we can concentrate and really play it how Stockhausen wanted. At the same time, I have to make some non-spontaneous decisions, somehow to push my students to play by leading them and breaking the silence at the beginning. My actions, in order to give them the opportunity to experience intuitive music and playing intuitively, are planned and rationalized. Rudolf Frisius said that Stockhausen has been continually proving his readiness and power to break free from what was known and to risk something totally new. Aus den Sieben Tagen is a very interesting and controversial piece, through which we can see that Stockhausen was not afraid of challenges and experiments. The aforementioned piece is rather hard to define or to be labeled. Is it a kind of musical theater, just a performance, or a ritual on stage? It can be a vocal piece as well as an instrumental one. We can also use, we don't have to even use instruments as Stockhausen was doing with a hammer, for example. Intuitive music existed in Stockhausen's output for a long time after Aus den Sieben Tagen. He was using that. Also his son, Markus Stockhausen, is now giving intuitive music concerts and workshops. There are some composers and bands that are interested in the same idea and still perform intuitive music. I think that its uniqueness comes from a lot of freedom and the possibility to use imagination. Intuitive music sets musicians free from what they learned from cliches. It helps to express oneself, but at the same time, for some of people, that can be a limitation. It is similar to a couple of music educational programs, like Pomelo, for example, where it is believed that one can produce music only after being immersed in it and being filled with it. We can also see some similarities to, for example, Chinese music, where, according to a legend, in order to produce real music that was united with nature, a musician had to understand processes and emotion within him. Also, thinking of a sound as something endless, thinking of no space nor time, is present in Eastern philosophy. Poetic texts that the score consists of are a kind of Stockhausen's diary. They are witnesses of what happened in his life and also his own music therapy. While playing them, one is on the boundary of playing intuitively and rationalizing it. But one has to be very conscious because it is a music being born here and now, and one has to express himself by music. To sum up, I would like to quote Satprem, who wrote about Sri Aurobindo, but these words, in my opinion, can be also said about Stockhausen. By following him step by step in his prodigious exploration, we are led to the most important discovery of all times, to the threshold of the great secret that is to change the face of this world, namely that consciousness is power. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Katarzyna. Is that right, Katarzyna?
Katarzyna, no problem.
Do we have any questions? Yes.
Thank you for the wonderful paper. I was wondering if you've looked into because this whole happened in the 60s, and there were some similar things happening in the US with Fluxus, with the Bolton Feldman, Cage, like these kind of verbal scores that are kind of at the boundary of poetry and music. And so, do you think? I mean, have you looked into how that might have influenced Stockhausen, or because I think it preceded. I mean, it happened before '68. So
yes,
and Stockhausen is very good at trademarking ideas.
Yes,
and,
he is.
You know,
I wanted just to
ignoring
say that.
precedents and so on.
Yeah, of course. When I was looking for just information about intuitive music, I only found out that the term was just made by Stockhausen, and there is nothing that was made before. In America, in the United States, they were just calling it aleatoric music mostly, but I'm aware that many composers were doing it before, or even in historic, in music from history, we can find some scores that there are just letters or just words, and we have to improvise somehow according to them. So this is nothing new, but at the same time, Stockhausen made the theory, how it should look like, although this is just an idea that, in my opinion, is not so easy to get into reality, but at the same time, sometimes it can. So for Stockhausen, there is a lot of philosophy in this kind of music, because he thought that it is not something unconscious. This is not. This is something like in one of the pieces he wrote. One should open himself to like a radio, to be a radio that receives the waves from the super consciousness. So I think that the biggest difference is just the philosophy and marketing that Stockhausen was very popular of.
Do we have any other questions? Yeah.
I'm really very happy to have heard your presentation.
Thank you.
And also to have heard this trademarking idea being brought up. I think it's much more about trademarking than about anything else. particularly these ideas, referring to Indian philosophy or Chinese philosophy, that's all fake. After all, what India really produced was music which was really extremely well structured, and
yes.
so the Chinese even more so. You can't really have proper music without this aspect of firm structuring, and I think it's more trademarking than anything else. Mm-hmm. Perhaps I think one person you mentioned Americans in this in the indeterminacy, chance music, whatever someone wish to call it, but it's kind of trying to really enter into the sound, to feel the sound as it is. Perhaps another name springs to my mind. Mm-hmm. That would be Chelsea.
Yeah.
Who I think immensely more interesting composer.
Yeah.
But of course, analysts don't touch him. You hardly ever hear a paper on Chelsea, really.
There is a book in Polish about Chelsea.
I know a person who wrote, I don't remember her name, but she was in Belgrade a month ago.
Yes, that's very probable. So Chelsea was also, this is very interesting for me, that he was composing in his mind and not even trying to write it down. So this is somehow similar, but Stockhausen just wrote it down. I think the most interesting thing is how the time, what was happening around Stockhausen influenced him to write such things, because this is just what Satprem was writing about Sri Aurobindo. This is just the same, but in the musical field. So,
thank you.
Any other questions? I'll just make a few quick comments myself. I think one of the things which interestingly separates what Stockhausen did with these pieces to, for example, the Americans and various other kind of text pieces like Christian Wolff, for example, is the idea of the intuitive music. Mm-hmm. It is actually a very different approach to how you play it and how you think about it. Something I don't know if you know anything about this. I've played these pieces a lot myself and with students. And something I've always wondered, I noticed when you put the chart of all the pieces at the beginning, that Stockhausen says most of them are for ensemble, but just a few of them have got specified numbers of instruments,
yes.
Like the first one is for approximately 4 instruments.
I found also lectures on intuitive music that he gave in the 70s in London, and people were asking him, so what should be the ensemble that you're using? And he said about this ideal one, so this is very interesting that somehow he was contradicting himself, like he gave some informations in order to have nice music,
so
like those
was
duos
he suggesting
and those
specific
things.
Instruments or?
No, never.
I just wondered why some of them are just a specific number of instruments, which is unusual.
I don't know.
Yeah.
He was just saying about the piece, like it will develop better when there are fewer people, because there will be no, everyone plays at the same time, or we perceive it as a chaos, while we can also see solos, duos, and etc. The more we have, the more musicians we have, the less it's you cannot perceive it so well how many of them are playing. So that was his idea mostly. But I think this is very interesting that he was always searching for new colors in the music. So, for example, he was playing one of the pieces with sandpaper, with a block of wood, and other performers were just playing, for example, a saxophone or something like this. Or he was just reading a book during the performance, so he was doing crazy things.
And there's also just one of them that curiously says, "Do not rehearse."
Yes. Yeah. There is one that, the first one, I think richtige Dauern, do not rehearse. Yeah, but it is mostly, you have to get into this stage and just go on the stage and just play it. And not, in order not to make, for example, some repetitions. This is just the idea, not to make repetitions that will somehow create the style of this music that Stockhausen wanted to get rid of. Any musical style that he saw in Eastern music, in free jazz even. Because in free jazz, yes, the idea is similar, but you have mostly certain instruments that you use in order to call it jazz. So he wanted to get rid of those things.
Yeah, and the whole association with the language.
Yes.
Yeah. Any more questions? No? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. We'll move on. So now it's a pleasure to welcome Mark. Is it Konevko, your surname? Kunuko Konevko. One of the hard things about doing this is getting your tongue around people's names. So Mark is from Milwaukee, and he's going to be talking to us about the rational and intuitive aspects of Messiaen's music.
I think so.
You could enable, because if you have examples, it will not show them. Can you start?
Yes.
And open again. And enable.
Voila. Good afternoon. This article will examine the early organ work of Messiaen, the Nativity of our Lord, written in 1935. This presentation is a restricted examination of the intuitive and rational compositional approaches used by Messiaen. Using his inventive modes of limited transposition that dictate harmonies, birdsong as a model for melody, and Hindu desi-talas for rhythmic structures that emulate rhythmic flow in nature, Messiaen weaves an original fabric of music. Being a believer in Catholic teaching, Messiaen manifests this belief through his music. The perceived dichotomy of intuition and rationality in music composition examined with the writings of Bergson, Blanchard, and Chudnow. Intuition is the capability to obtain knowledge lacking verification of actualities. And reason, on the other hand, is the ability for deliberating, constructing conventions and or views grounded on original or current information. Reasoning is associated with a process of thought or cognition, of deductive, inductive, abductive, or various modes of logic where a formal proof is sought. Intuition, and not theoretical rational thought, takes us into benevolent association with rational reality. Bergson, a contemporary of Messiaen, says, of these departures toward an affirmation and these returns to the primary intuition are categorized by zigzaggings of a doctrine which develops, that is to say, which loses itself, finds itself again, and endlessly corrects itself, close quote. Being a great improviser on the organ, Messiaen often allowed his inspirations that flowed in improvisation to spill over into or become his source of sonic material used in his written compositions. But his compositions were on no occasion spontaneous. Messiaen says, I've never improvised in my work. Untainted, original, and unique improvisation could be considered as a pure form of intuition supported by both technical skill and an abundant ability to creatively react to sonic material. Messiaen demonstrates in his composition no improvisation, but rather a disciplined organization of his compositional elements. Where does intuition generate? Perhaps in early influences. What physical, environmental, rural or urban, did the composer develop in his youth? What sounds, literature, situations affected the composer? What security factors, religious beliefs, or lack thereof impacted the individual? It is these minutiae that become the font for intuition and instinct. The duration or the time that is inevitable when discussing experience cannot be separated from the intention to acknowledge the intuition. Both intuition and its conscious recognition become the basis for knowledge and rational advancement. In the writings of Bergson, again, action plays always a constant progression that suggests a fundamental length of time between a choice and its intended end. Again, I quote from Bergson, the most essential of primary instincts are really therefore vital processes. The potential consciousness that accompanies them is generally actualized only on the outset of an act and leaves the rest of the progress to go on by itself. It would only have to expand more widely and then dive into its own depth completely to be one with the generative force of life. These vital processes are the foundation within the realm of conscious realization of intuition, making the portrayed product a likeness of the conscious direction of expression. Conceivably, without intuition, the vigorous process of composition would not be complete. The balance of intuition and reason within the creative process binds the intellect with instinct. Intuition itself might mirror the intellect identifying that life. Bergson goes on. Intuition may bring the intellect to recognize that life does not go on into a category of the many, nor yet into that of the one, that neither mechanically or causality nor finality can give sufficient interpretation of that vital process. Living circumstances, environment, and beliefs are important developmental aspects. Messiaen, in his younger years, recounts the time that he spent in Grenoble, where the mountains influenced his development. The plays of Shakespeare, Don Giovanni, of Mozart, The Damnation of Faust by Berlioz, Debussy, along with nature and birdsong and Catholic theology, all had a profound influence on Messiaen. These influences, these flexive creative realities, are the seeds that would later grow into the material that is Messiaen's intuition. Ropnell equates instinct with intuition. According to Ropnell, the conscious realization of these moments in the continuum of time dwells in the realm of intuition. The free nature of intuition feeds the appetite of reason. Another consideration of our conscious intuitive process for Messiaen is his devout belief in the teachings of the Catholic Church and his love of nature as a perfect creation. In an interview with Claude Samuel, Messiaen states, and I quote, "I have an absolute horror of cities, a horror of the one that I live in. Despite its many beauties, I speak of the French capitals and the horror of all the bad taste man has accumulated around him, whether for his needs or for various other reasons. You'll notice, as I do, that there are never any errors of taste in nature. You'll never find fault in lighting or coloring, in birdsong, an error in rhythm, melody, or counterpoint." Close quote. For Messiaen, observed nature is a wellspring of inspiration and a model for his writing. His faith in Catholicism acts both as a tether and a liberating journey. When asked about the relationship between his faith and nature, Messiaen responds, "Linked, yet at the same time independent. I love nature for itself. Certainly, like St. Paul, I see in nature a manifestation of one of the aspects of divinity, but it's equally certain that God's creations are not God himself. Moreover, all God's creations are enclosed in time, and time is one of God's strangest creatures because it is totally opposed to him who is eternal by nature, to him who is without beginning, end, or succession." Bachelard addresses Bergson's concept of the élan vital, a term coined by Bergson that means life force. As for knowledge of the creative instant itself, where is it most certainly attained if not in the experience of the sudden burst of consciousness? Isn't the élan vital most active in that instant, that sudden burst? Certainly, time is experienced, and currently time is experienced as a continuation of events that are irreversible, where a single attempt to understand the past through the present is radically different from trying to elucidate the present through the past. Again, Bergson, duration is made up of durationless instances. Just a line, a straight line is made up of dimensionless points. These points in time or events are the material that construct knowledge. Messiaen addresses the usage of time or duration in his compositions with a system of developed structures taken from Hindu rhythms. Messiaen states, I consider that rhythm is the primordial and perhaps essential part of music. I think it probably existed before melody and harmony, and in fact, I have a secret preference for this element. He elects to use nature and its apparent chaotic rhythms as a model for his compositional style. In Messiaen's words, rhythmic music is music that scorns repetition, straightforwardness, and equal divisions. In short, it's music inspired by the motions and movements of nature, movements to free and unequal durations, close quote. Durations or events in time are similar for Messiaen. Specifically, the structural plan that he employs is from a collection of 120 decitalas found in a treatise written by 13th century Shargadeva. In Sanjavita Natnakara, Messiaen offers his concise explanation of this system's general rules. In his words, the principle of the addition of a dot, the principle of increasing and decreasing of one value or two, the principle of inexact augmentation, and that of disassociation and coagulation. Messiaen has methodically integrated these rhythms in his music to convey sensations related to Catholic teachings, in particular, eternity. Messiaen was overcome with interest of these 120 talas. He studied them, analyzed them, and combined them into his own compositions. Messiaen thought they were the pinnacle of Hindu and human rhythmic construction. And now briefly I'd like to talk about the Nativity. Analysis of both the musical and theological importance and monumental scope of this work is beyond this possibility of this presentation. What follows is really a brief reflection. The Nativity is a work of a spiritual image of God. 1935 was a tumultuous era marked by social unrest. The rightist Stravinsky riots in February of 1934 and the leftist victory of the Socialist Popular Front in June of 1936 was a time of significant uncertainty. At the same time, renovations on the organ in Trinité, where Messiaen played in 1934 and 1935, included a 2 2/3 Nazard in both the Positive and Récit manuals, a 1 3/5 tierce in the Positive, and a 3-rank cymbal in the Récit. These were new colors, new tonal possibilities that inspired Messiaen to compose in a new style. This new style was uncharacteristic of the existing French musical aesthetic. The structure of the work is a product of reason. The individual movements not only have titles but include biblical inscriptions and an explanatory preface. This preface precedes Messiaen's important treatise, Technique of My Musical Language. The preface introduces for the first time his modes of limited transposition. He declares that these modes act as principal means of expression in his composition and presents the concept of enlarged pedals, the added dot, the progressive widening of intervals, and the chord on the dominant, all of which appear in the movements. The work contains 9 compositions that are divided in 4 groups. in Messiaen's words, 9 pieces in all, to honor the maternity of the Blessed Virgin. The first book contains the Virgin and Child, the shepherds and eternal designs. The second book has 2 pieces, the Word and the children of God. The third book is comprised of 3 pieces, the angels, Jesus accepts suffering, which is radically different than the rest of the movements, and the Magi. And the fourth book has only 1 piece, God Among Us, the culmination of the entire work theologically and symbolically. And now a brief discussion regarding the 3 themes in the opening page of God Among Us. And I apologize ahead of time for the musical examples from my scores. For Messiaen, the symbolic significance of the number 3 represents the Holy Trinity and cannot be separated, signifying the undividable God. He views 3 as the first odd number and comments that it stands for the perfect symbol of divinity. The first theme is based on Lakshimak and Ragnavardhana rhythmic forms. The significance of using 2 rhythmic patterns represents the simplest representation of humanity because it technically is a prime number. This first theme includes a descending bass line using the Ragnavardhana theme in the pedal as it represents the glorious descent of the second person of the Trinity into human form. The second theme powerfully diverges from the first in character and in sound with a dramatic shift in organ registration. The warmth and slow-moving quality communicates the love of Christ for man. And the third theme, in bird-style song, does not directly quote a precise bird song, but is more elaborate and extravagant in nature. Messiaen's choice of the fourth mode of limited transportation is an interesting one. One can analyze the number of scale degrees of mode 4 as 1, 1, 1, 3, 1, 1, 1, 3. But his choice of introducing the work with a retrograde version of mode 4 where the scale begins on degrees become 3, 1, 1, 1, 3, 1, 1, 1 is absolutely fascinating. Messiaen begins with a perfect symbol for divinity, 3, descending from above into human form. The number 1 is also chosen because of its indivisibility, often signifying the indivisible nature of God. At this point, I'd like to play those first 3 themes for you. That's that Lakshma. Now the Ragnavardhana in the pedal. Second theme. And then the third theme, the bird song. In conclusion, the constructed quantitative machinations of a composer's modes of limited transposition, the rhythmic polyphony, the non-retrogradable rhythms, the procedure of augmentation and diminution, added and subtracted values of the birdsong, all of them support Messiaen's highly developed rational approach to composition. Chudnow states, intuition are inputs to theoretical reasoning. Intuition, or the creative spark, precedes an intention to describe or compose. Intuition infers conscious awareness of the idea for a composer to write down a formulation that includes the initial intuition and time. Blanchard also says, knowledge is preeminently the work of time. Close quote. Indeed, intuitions are contributions to the cognitive expression and the conscious awareness of duration, where the instant of an intuition supports Messiaen's controlled thought processes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, very much. Do we have any questions for Mark? Nobody got a question for Mark? Oh.
Well, I was simply thrilled to hear this presentation. The question is almost, I would say, concerns a technical matter, but perhaps with some wider implications. You mentioned number 3, prime number, indivisible. Now, we know Messiaen's predilection for prime numbers because they are indivisible as divinity is indivisible. Are there any other prime numbers that play some role in this music? Have you discovered that, perhaps?
Yes, there's quite a few.
5, 7s, or 17s, or whatever.
There are. The more you go deeper into his music, in particular, this collection of 9 pieces, he plays with numbers constantly. And it really shows up, for example, in the Jesus Accepts Suffering. There's a tremendous play with the number 7. So yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I just have a quick one on the subject of numbers. Obviously, there's a lot written about Messiaen's music. But given his interest in nature, is there any evidence that he engaged with things like the Golden Section or the Fibonacci series or even chaos theory? I mean, I know that came quite late in his life, but...
Not that I found.
Oh, interesting.
Not at all.
It's just one of those composed things, you know.
You're right.
Yeah. But he approached it from a very different perspective, I think, yeah, from the religious angle, yeah.
If I may jump in, I believe that in Turangalila Symphony, the 6th movement, and particularly this Garden of the Sleep of Love, and particularly the climax of the movement, falls somewhere around the Golden Section. Now, it has yet to be tested, but I believe it's somewhere around there. So perhaps we might investigate that. And
it's probably, I mean, thinking about intuition, it's one of those things that happens instinctively as well with a lot of composers. I mean, there's a lot written about Bartók's music, and it's very controversial whether he actually used the Fibonacci series or whether it just is inherent in his thinking. You know, it's one of those. I had a student, sorry, just to bypass at Goldsmiths, I had a student, PhD student, who composed a piece which he said was completely intuitively composed, and when I looked at it, it was completely based around the Fibonacci sequence, but he was totally unaware of it. It's just one of those things which is an intuitive aspect, so whether Messiaen did it instinctively or rationally is an interesting thought. Anyway, thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, we have another question.
Well, I'm not sure if it's an important one, but I was just wondering, you talk about Messiaen being influenced by nature, and whenever he has an influence, he has a very specific way of using an influence in his music, like rhythms, talas, and the bird songs do come from. Are there other sources in his music, or is it just something he says about nature? Are there other ways that nature comes into his music besides bird songs?
I think it's. Oh, go ahead.
So I was I'm now writing a PhD about Grażyna Pstrokońska-Nawratil, who is a pupil of Messiaen, and I was somehow trying to get the connections between two of them. I'm trying to speak in Polish now, sorry. So Messiaen was using the symmetry, which is something from nature, and he was claiming that. And also, if we look how he was perceiving those synesthetic thoughts, they are also in relation to nature, most of the colors he saw. And there are also some nature-inspired, let's say, backgrounds to his music. Like if we think of Saint Francis, there is a lot of this nature in the background. So mostly, maybe it's not, sometimes the birds are the most important source, but there are others. Plus, nature is a very ambiguous thing, so we can perceive it in many different ways. If we want, we can also find nature-inspired pieces in Mozart, even when there is nothing, but there is symmetry or there is regularity. But also chaos is nature, so there is a lot of those things. But Messiaen was talking mostly about the color and symmetry, and some of the background things are appearing there.
Thank you both.
Anything else?
I think that the relationship that nature with Messiaen is like, it's not a great analogy, but putting on clothes in the morning. You wear them without thinking of them. And
depends how fashion conscious you are.
That's why it wasn't such a great analogy, but it's something that is kind of an integral part of how he views life and his compositional style. It's kind of, you can go through his pieces and point out in particular the synesthesia and color and light in the Quartet for the End of Time. You can pick out certain spots where it is, but it's kind of an overall that's on his person. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. So now we have Matt Ambrosio from the University of Wisconsin, who's going to be talking about the music of Debussy.
I'm good. Yeah, that's fine. Perfect. Thank you. I noticed you guys put the Wisconsinites together. That's, just so you know, the weather is just as cold in Wisconsin right now. So thank you so much for having me here, and thank you all for listening, and thank you all for your earlier papers today. They've been so wonderful. So, the Pastoral of Debussy's Sonata for flute, viola, and harp opens with a slippery, if not haphazard, duet between flute and harp that eventually gives way to an equally slippery solo viola line. Let's listen to the opening measures, shown in example 1 in your handout. When the material of measures 4 through 6, what I'm calling the B module, returns in measure 50, the effect is a bit jarring. It is the first instance in which any material in the movement returns, but its return is neither prepared nor expected, and there are differences between iterations. As you can see in example 2, the measures preceding simply slip into the return without ever offering a reprise of measures 1 through 3. The return, which I will call B prime, also does not spark a rehashing of the exposition like one would expect of a recapitulation. Instead, a glistening harp arpeggio follows B prime, washing over the sound space. And even more surprising, another iteration of the refrain, what I will call B double prime, directly follows the arpeggio. As shown in each of these iterations, in the 3 iterations, they differ from their compatriots. Having heard B, let's listen from B prime to B double prime. And you can follow along in your handout. Oh, goodness. Sorry. There we go. I've summarized the most salient differences between iterations of the module. The near juxtaposition of B prime and B double prime foregrounds their main differences, the apex pitch. Though we view these iterations as restatements, their apparent differences differentiate them. Thus the real problem: how can something be simultaneously treated as both the same but also different? As philosopher François Zorbichvili states, quote, "What is at issue is the existential sense of return as a problem. What happens in this line that, returning to itself, differentiates an interior from an exterior," unquote. I'm reminded of Stephen Rings's event and spatial network diagrams, where in a spatial network, a node is individuated, but in an event network, a node can repeat and its numerous iterations are treated as equals. An event is somehow both individuated and multiplicitous. Though we often sweep this problem under an analytical rug, preferring to explore the benefits yielded by either schema, our ability to differentiate iterations of a return while at the same time treating them as the same has great implications for understanding its role in the composition at large. For the pastoral, solving this problem can gain us insight into the oddity of the representations of B prime and B double prime. I find Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's notion of refrain resonates strongly with my experience of the returning B module. In this presentation, I will develop Deleuze and Guattari's notion of abstract spatiality, which they term territoriality, and show how it relates to musical refrain. As I will explore, these terms are best understood in the context of their argument against psychoanalysis and development of schizoanalysis. Returning to Debussy's Pastoral, I will suggest an interpretation informed by Deleuze and Guattari's theories that I feel common music theoretical practice cannot approach. As has been explored in Chris Stovers's recent Music Theory Online article, Time, Territorialization, and Improvisational Space, Deleuze and Guattari's concept of refrain has strong implications for their process of territorialization, which is most fully explored in their co-authored works, A Thousand Plateaus and What is Philosophy. Therein, the authors give a grandiose yet slippery definition of refrain. The refrain is a crystal of space-time. It acts upon that which surrounds it, extracting from it various vibrations or decompositions, projections or transformations. The refrain also has a catalytic function to assure indirect interactions between elements devoid of so-called natural affinity, and thereby to form and organized masses. The refrain is therefore of a crystal or protean type. It is of the nature of the refrain to become concentrated by elimination, in a very short moment, as though moving from the extremes to a center, or on the contrary, to develop by addition, moving from the center to the extremes, and also to travel these routes in both directions. The refrain fabricates time. It would seem that for Deleuze and Guattari, the refrain holds a privileged position, for it can define time, and as I will argue, space. They go on to call the refrain any aggregate of matters of expression that draws a territory and develops into territorial motives and landscapes, unquote. It is the marking of a territory, communicating the coding of an assemblage of musical material. But before diving deeper into Deleuze and Guattari's loaded lexicon, allow me to offer a cursory review of Debussy's Pastoral to give a better sense of its refrain's positioning. This is figure 1 on the back of your handout. I have segmented musical modules in a manner that I doubt would garner much disagreement. That said, I do not intend to imply that this is the form of the Pastoral. In fact, it's a bit of a confusing piece, and even in my remembering, I have a hard time piecing its modules together, hence the diagram. We could, as some scholars have, engage in a more traditional music theoretical and analytic approach, diagramming the movement's harmonic moves, following a voice-leading pattern, and tracing a direct lineage back to a more traditional harmonic practice. But attempts to search for an underlying system are all too often successful due only to confirmation bias. We perceive the system we aim to find. Overcorrecting, attempting a more agnostic approach, can prove equally problematic. For instance, a set theoretical method that focuses on analyzing shifts in pitch collection can often play out as a lackluster sporting with the music. These musical modules are, in truth, just a bit too slippery for these approaches. They are replete with false starts and unstructured meter, never materializing a cogent musical phrase. The very opening, for example, sounds like a series of fleeting thoughts bleeding into one another. The pastoral's first cadence sounds more like a last resort than a closing of a thought, as if the opening's state of disarray prompts the trio to at least produce something convincingly musical. And much of the pastoral plays out this way. There are moments of ensemble coherence, but the work never generates a clear narrative or logic of events. And the label pastoral seems quite appropriate. Unlike a dance movement, which follows a particular formal layout and is replete with consistent rhythms, linearity, and harmonic trajectory, as if the gestural constraints of dance trickle down to the very structuring of the music, a somewhere, sometime, a pastoral simply suggests the outside. It does not imply a particular plot, a theme, or any sort of practice. It's more of an anywhere, anytime. A pastoral scene is open to the forces of nature and has a wonderful sense of natural indeterminacy, where the music, separated from society's influence, is subject to nature's ebbs and flows. The pastoral, as you know, is, of course, a common genre in the visual arts as well, conjuring similar connotations as its musical correlate. Pastoral paintings depict the outdoors, offering a window into a scene, but that window can seem arbitrarily placed, as if it were a photograph. Such paintings inherently infer that the depicted scene stretches beyond the confines of the frame, though we cannot quite know for sure what the beyond looks like. Consider a selection of Claude Monet's series of water lily paintings. The scene is arbitrary. One can imagine a view of the other end of the pond that is also gratifying. Because there is no clearly defined subject, the painting would not lose any of its charm if, for example, the camera panned right, leaving out that yellow tree. For I imagine that including the unformed milieu beyond the frame could be just as interesting. Would the blue reflection in the water instead balance a different object than the yellow tree? Would it inherit a new functionality in my perception of it? It would be impossible to know, of course, but the sheer act of imagining is something the pastoral cultivates. The same sense is cultivated in Debussy's Pastoral. But unlike a picture, spatiality can only be metaphorical. As such, I find Deleuze and Guattari's notion of territory most appropriate for the current study. They relate the process of territorialization to psychic processes, using Freudian psychoanalysis as a foil. Psychoanalysis, they argue, fails in its reliance on a neutralized state of affairs. Deleuze and Guattari understand the psyche as a multiplicity of desires, one that, in its consistent breaking with established structuring, might be characterized as schizophrenic. But they do not take this as a pathology. In opposition to the received psychoanalytical understanding of desire, indicative of lack or deficit, the authors awarded a positive function, taking it as a means by which limits are tested. Desire, to them, is the principal driver of creativity and play. The psyche is, in their terms, a desiring machine. Or to use another metaphor, it is a, quote, body without organs. It does not embody inherently differentiated functioning constructs, but rather points of intensity, whose potential functionalities are unrestricted. To territorialize, then, is to assign function, however provisional it may be. What is important is that this understanding does epistemological work. The body without organs, quote, is not a notion or concept, but a practice, unquote. It is, quote, what remains when you take everything away, unquote, when reality is stripped of fantasy. Any attempt to fix the nature of desire, to construct a sort of sieve through which to analyze desire, be it religious, political, economic, psychoanalytic, is thus to propagate a fantasy. It is to attempt a dissection of a body without organs. Indeed, these sorts of sieves are the product of the social realm. In received psychoanalysis, the unconscious, the interior, and conscious exterior are firmly differentiated, the former primary and the latter secondary. And in the analytic function, projects the latter onto the former, internalizing a sort of social control that channels and checks desire in creating a sort of normalized system. A similar relation obtains it more generally. Capitalist economics itself presumes an active analysis of unconscious desire, and thus a regulation of desire, one normalized in a series of social forms. For Deleuze and Guattari, that which is false in both received psychoanalysis and capitalist economics, revealing itself in a sort of semiotic coding, arises from this sequence. That the notion that that which is conscious, and thus has an analytic function, arises from that which is unconscious. Rather, they would place the unconscious and the conscious in a dialectic relationship. They write, quote, from the very beginning of this study, we have maintained both that the social production and desiring production, the unconscious, are one and the same, and that they have differing regimes, with the result that a social form of production exercises an essential repression of desiring production, and also that desiring production, real production, is potentially capable of demolishing the social form. Thus, the desiring machine, creativity and play, and the mechanisms of social formation, control, each exercise an influence on the other and can in fact reverse the sequence of unconscious to conscious. Indeed, in order to interact with social forces, the unconscious may absorb into itself a structure such as a hierarchy, engaging in a sort of mimicry. The mistake of psychoanalysis is to assume that such a hierarchy originates in the unconscious and is then manifested in the social realm, and hence to assume that this hierarchy is somewhat natural. This, the author posits, is also the mistake of capitalist economics, and thus the justification for a naturalization of repression. Both psychoanalysis and capitalism arise as products of the unconscious, but in their desire to regulate desire, they deny their own stakes in the unconscious. Deleuze and Guattari's more dialectical system is musically suggestive. Composition originates with a desiring machine. Its product, analogous to the social or discursive formation, in turn represses the work of the desiring machine, denying its origins in creativity. Music, thus, is neither wholly the product of creation nor the creation of product. For example, music that depends on the notion of teleology does in fact deny its own origins by telling a single coherent story about itself within itself. We could further view music theory's dealings with music as a socially formed repression of music's desire. For instance, music theory takes tonal harmony, much like psychoanalysis does the Oedipus complex, as a natural formation. Tonal theory could thus be considered a discursive formation that represses music's desire. By the same token, music would not be possible without such theories and discursive systemizations. This may all seem a bit recursive, but perhaps with such a dialectical thinking about music, we can come to accept an ultimately contingent nature of musical thought and relish in our individuated experiences of music, however reified our experience with it may seem. Deleuze and Guattari put forth a botanic analogy that compares the psyche's arborescent, tree-like abilities to its rhizomic, root network-like tendencies, which they fear are too often considered aberrational. The psyche can generate structured hierarchical formations like a tree, or it can reach out beyond bounds schizophrenically, like a network of weeds. Deleuze and Guattari suggest music can exhibit arborescent and rhizomic qualities, but award the rhizomic nature a certain amount of extra significance. They say, music has always sent out lines of flight, like so many transformational multiplicities, ever overturning the very codes that structure or arborify it. That is why musical form, right down to its ruptures and proliferations, is comparable to a weed, a rhizome. I really like that they call music a weed. I don't know why. For Deleuze and Guattari, there exists an unavoidable dialectic between the intent of the desiring machine and its reified products, which deny their origins in desire. Consider the notion of music theory again. Of course, a music theory is itself the product of desire, but the important notion of the botanic analogy is that the arborescent begins from a single point of origin like a seed and grows into an entire organism. The theory may have been sparked by a desire to subsume reality in a single argument, but the theory must grow, differentiate, etc. When it does grow, it does so in a specific location within specific bounds, distinguishing it from the rhizomic. Arborescent constraints are the markings of territory. The refrain has an important role in territorialization, acting as either the small territorial / arborescent or large deterritorializing or rhizomic refrain. Music, Deleuze and Guattari suggest, requires the small refrain, quote, in order to transform it from within, deterritorialize it, producing a refrain of the second type as the final end in music, the cosmic refrain, unquote. As such, the refrain can enlist any of its three aspects, quote, sometimes, sometimes, sometimes. Sometimes one goes from chaos to the threshold of a territorial assemblage, directional components, infra-assemblage. Sometimes one organizes the assemblage, dimensional components, intra-assemblage. Sometimes one leaves the territorial assemblage for another assemblage, or for somewhere else entirely, interassemblage, components of passage, or even escape. And all three at once, forces of chaos, terrestrial forces, cosmic forces, all of these confront each other and converge in the territorial refrain. I find a visual representation helpful. Quote, like a child in the dark, gripped with fear, unquote. The refrain finds directionality in a milieu. In becoming expressive, the refrain delineates a territory, speaking the language of the territory, and gaining functionality. Desiring to reach beyond the territory, the refrain takes on a different expressive function and deterritorializes, forming a line of flight, diagonal to the coordinate system of the terrain. The journey of the refrain, whether territorial or deterritorializing, is what is subjectifiable in music. It is the story we tell about music. I realize that this exposition is a bit dense, and that it hardly does justice to Deleuze and Guattari's work as a whole, but we need to return to Debussy's Pastoral, which I feel cultivates Deleuze and Guattari's threefold process of territorialization. Recall the opening measures and the first instance iteration of the B module. Much like a child's song, the refrain forms a sense of directionality in the unstructured milieu, from which it springs forth, an infra-assemblage, forming order in chaos. But this is not enough to territorialize the pastoral. For the rest of the A and B sections, even the cadences and dance figures are fleeting. When B prime sounds, it comes as a surprise. It is not prepared as B had been, but that does not really offend. Though it differs from B, we learn to accept B prime as refrain and project what may follow, assigning a territorial function to B prime. The garnered harmonic support of B prime sounds more confirming than differentiating, a territorial signature. B prime causes us to trace back over all that we had heard and form a narrative of events. It is the territorializing refrain, the small refrain, the refrain that confirms the territorial assemblage. We think to ourselves, I've heard this before, so how did I get from then to now? What have I traversed? The harp flourish that follows B prime and washes over the bound space could be considered the line of flight, for it does not reconcile the established territory. Thus, the terrain must be reterritorialized. B double prime, then, is our large refrain, as if a product of play, what had been the apex pitch A flat slides up to A natural in B double prime. And unlike B prime, B double prime regains the melodic echo of B, proof that, as with B, we can expect something to follow, but only after the notable pitch difference that affirms the possibility of a reterritorialization. Thereafter, the musical modules of the A section are altered and reordered in A prime. For once we have a conception of the terrain, once we've territorialized, we may move beyond it at will, recoding our experience. An approach such as the one I have presented here is suggestive of how we hear music. We can construct a multiplicity of narratives about a refrain that at any moment aborify or slip away. I do not mean to suggest eschewing theorization. Rather, I view an interaction with music as a play of desires, the desire to structuralize coupled with the desire to slip out of structure. The pastoral realizes and carries out this process. In enacting a schizoanalytical mode of thought, we need not rely on any pre-existing theoretical method, but we are also not prohibited from such theorization. We may still interact with the salient musical features, but approach them with a realization of our desires. To that extent, a Deleuzian approach offers more of a methodology of method than a method. We could consider a composition to unfold as a process of theorization and re-theorization, theory turned about itself. I will leave you with a passage from Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus. The difference between noise and sound is definitely not a basis for a definition of music, or even for a distinction between musician birds and non-musician birds. Rather, it is the labor of the refrain. Does it remain territorial and territorializing, or is it carried away in a moving block that draws a traversal across all coordinates and all of the intermediaries between the two? Music is precisely the adventure of the refrain, the way music lapses back into a refrain, the way it lays hold of a refrain, makes it more and more sober, reduces it to a few notes, then takes it down a creative line that is so much richer, no origin or end of which in sight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt, for that very interesting perspective on Debussy's music. Do we have any questions, observations?
I realize I was working with the oldest composer here, today. That's pretty interesting.
Yep, on here.
I don't think I'll come up with a coherent question. Thank you for the paper. There was a lot of very interesting, I just wanted to mention that this, and that comes, I think, from this idea of territoire, and Debussy as time as space versus time as a chain of causality, like theological time. And I think I just wanted to say that this idea of time as space, and how can music create space, because it's kind of a paradox. What are the qualities that music must have to create this sense of space versus that I found that very interesting, and thank you for making me think more deeply about that.
Sure. So I just to clarify, I wasn't specifying that he's creating space through time. I'm rather saying, and this goes to the bigger project. Space and time, I would consider, are sort of born together. They're cognates in a sense, right? And this is the larger project. Obviously, this is part of my dissertation. So,
but our experience of space and time is radically different, because in time we're bound to a certain velocity.
Right. And what I would suggest is that using a Deleuzian approach, we can sort of have a multiplicity of perceptions of space and time, and that's kind of what I'm getting at here. You can also historically place Debussy's music in an interesting place in terms of history of science, where you have these late sonatas. I don't know if everybody knows these late sonatas. There are 3 of that was supposed to be 6. They were all composed from, I think, 1915 to 1917, which is the same window which Einstein published general relativity. 10 years prior was special relativity. So I'm not saying Debussy read Einstein or anything like that, of course, but I would suggest that there is a conception that is starting to shift our understanding of space and time at this moment in history, and that comes out of industrialization across the 19th century, where you have this sense of absolute time. GMT is sort of established in that period of time, railway systems, and people are starting to rethink what time actually is. And I'm just suggesting that, especially in Debussy's late music, these ideas of space and time become somewhat more malleable. It's not music that is, late 20th century where we would see music that is really trying to create verticalities of time and things like that, but it's sort of teaching us to understand that time and space can function in a way that we really hadn't seen them before. And I honestly think that Debussy's music kind of teaches us these things, which I find fascinating about it. Especially in this piece, this refrain that comes back is teaching us these sorts of ways of rethinking space. And it comes down to, in my opinion, irrational play. That I can imagine someone sitting at the piano playing this motive and just, let me slide up to A, instead of A flat. Let me just play with this idea. And this sort of irrational play then has to be sort of absorbed into the musical fabric.
Sorry, you said rational or irrational?
Irrational play. Yeah. Sure.
Chris at the back.
Thank you very much for the talk. It's very interesting. I particularly like the idea of what happens outside of the frame and how you might think about that in a musical refrain as well. This is probably a very banal question, but I'd be curious to hear more about your idea that when we first hear it, we are prepared for it, and we're not prepared later. Because my immediate instinct is that in some senses we're better prepared because we've just heard it, and I'm not sure what it is that you feel about that first statement, that we're prepared for it when we aren't later on.
Well, that's a great question. So the first segment, as you remember from hearing it, the viola takes the pitch from the flute, right? So it just carries and bleeds in. I wouldn't say we're prepared in any sort of harmonic sense or anything like that. But when we get the first return, when we get B prime, it's not prepared in that way whatsoever. However, it's gained harmonic support. That sort of supports the rest of the piece. I wish we could listen to the entire movement. Of course, we don't have time for those things. But I'll just mention that one of the biggest difference between the A section and the return of the A section is that, well, most of the A's and A flats have sort of shifted. So what I would suggest then is that second case of the refrain is sort of is an affirmation of the territory of this. Again, I don't mean to use tonal language, but it's an A flatness to it. In fact, the B section is in a 4-flat key signature, whereas the A section is basically in F. Well, the only cadences are to F major and C major, which is why I think Arthur Werk he really wanted to get a tonal look on things, which I don't think really works with the piece. However, yes, we're sort of prepared for it. But we're not unprepared when it returns. It's surprising, but it's not offensive, What I find more surprising is the third return, when we get that wash over, and then it comes back, and we had just heard it. They're so nearly juxtaposed that the differences they kind of stand out to me, I don't know if you feel that way. But does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's great. It's very interesting. Thank you.
Any more questions?
Thank you very much. And I didn't know territoriality. This is your word?
No. That's from Deleuze and Guattari. I'm borrowing that.
I just wondering why it's territoriality. Maybe it can be spatiality, because when you talk only about pitch, you can use this maybe, but we sense sound and we understand different sound, and then you can speak about space more.
Sure.
What do you think?
Sure. I borrow, I think I made this point in the paper. I consider their idea of territoriality analogous to a conception of spatiality. I think they use the term, though, to get away from traditions of use of spatiality, and they're trying to differentiate themselves from the history of spatiality as a concept. Now, what I consider then would be, so all this comes down to narrative, in my opinion, the way we process things. So when we are able to territorialize or spatialize something, that is the package we can understand it and communicate it, right? And I think that's probably why they went with territorial instead of spatial. They want to be able to assign it to any number of different facets of the music or any other facet of. I mean, their books are not on music. They write about music here and there, mostly Messiaen. But they're not musicians by any stretch of it. So they're not really thinking about pitch space, I guess. But thank you very much for the question.
Any further questions? No? Okay, thank you very much, Matt.
Thank you.
So thank you very much to all the presenters this morning for some very engaging talks and the interesting discussions we've had relating to them. Just to remind you of other events happening today, at 3 o'clock this afternoon there's a workshop given by the Micro Ensemble, which is in the Music Study Information Centre upstairs. Some of you went there yesterday, but I'm sure it'll be signpost. And then, of course, at 6 o'clock this evening there's a concert, Lithuanianness in Sacred Music. Where is that? Where will it be, the concert? Oh, it's in the church, yeah. The information's on here, and if we're lucky, we'll find it. Okay, thank you very much for a very stimulating morning. Bye.